We are going to be talking about the basics of tree fruit diseases today. And so I'm going to start my talk out with presenting the diseases of apple, which also apply to pear. And then I'm going to transition into the stone fruit or the particular peach diseases. So apple should be pretty applicable to all of our audience in the state of Illinois and beyond. And the peach is somewhat limited to the southern half of Illinois, as there are some hardiness issues with growing peach. So we're going to talk about the integrated pest management of our fruit crops. One of the key things to think about is the disease triangle. And so here I have a Venn diagram of the disease triangle. So we have to have a susceptible host, a pathogen, and a conducive environment for the disease to make itself known and to be applicable to our situation. And one of the ways that we can combat this is to plant resistant varieties. So if the variety is not susceptible, it's not going to need as much spray or fungicides. So choosing a resistant variety is one of the key things that you could do in getting started with managing diseases. Now we will talk about some of the alternative hosts for diseases, and if there are alternative hosts for a disease, it's best to get rid of those and lessen your susceptibility to the disease. We'll be covering some of the fungicide spray programs, and fungicides are what's going to be key to controlling your fungal diseases. And I have a few handouts at the short URL go.illinois.edu/GG2020. And so primarily we're going to be talking from a backyard perspective for today's talk. These diseases are applicable to the commercial level, but primarily we'll keep it on the backyard perspective. So this is a table of disease resistance for apple cultivars. And so your susceptibility is going to dictate possibly how many diseases you may find in your fruit. The more resistant a particular cultivar is, the less chance that you're going to have the particular disease that it's resistant to. And so there's a multitude of diseases here in the Midwest. And so we have listed here apple rust, fire blight, scab, and powdery mildew. And you see that there are differences among the types of diseases that particular fruit are susceptible or resistant to. And so if you pick Golden Delicious, maybe you like a Golden Delicious apple, but it is particularly susceptible and very susceptible to powdery mildew. And if you want to see more of these resistant cultivar choices, not only for apple, but for the other fruits, there is a Midwest home fruit production guide. And so you can find that at this link. And it is very helpful in giving you some of the cultural practices as well for growing tree fruit. Now we do have seasonal spray programs for apples. And so even during the dormant season, there are horticulture oil sprays that can be applied, and they help to mitigate mostly insects. But whenever you're dealing with insects, you're also dealing with disease, because some of the insects do transfer diseases, and these controls of insects are also applicable to controlling disease. So I have in this table the developmental stages of apples. And so in this link that I have listed below is a publication from Purdue, Managing Pest and Home Fruit Plantings. And I like that publication because it has very vivid photographs of what all of these particular developmental stages are. And so it basically takes you through the progression of the buds through petal fall. And there are different developmental stages for each of our fruit, and those are included in that publication. Another good publication to have on hand is Pest Management for the Home Landscape. That's published by the University of Illinois Extension, and it has spray schedules as well. And I've included some of these spray schedules in a variety of means in that link to the handouts. And so we see here on the right-hand side in the column of diseases, we have diseases like scab, where you can have a primary infection, and it's best to try to mitigate that primary infection so you have a less chance of the secondary infections later on in the season. But there's a multitude of diseases, and this just gives you an idea of some of the relationship between the developmental stages and the diseases that we can find in tree fruit. So we have cultural and sanitation practices that we need to take into consideration when we're growing tree fruit. And one of the key things that I find missing in the homeowner perspective is that they may plant a fruit tree, but they don't spend the time to adequately prune it or thin the fruit. And so that's a key cultural aspect that often gets missed. And so trying to prune properly, that is a great benefit for mitigating disease, because you're going to increase the amount of light that enters the canopy and also the air movement, and that's going to help to dry out the foliage and reduce the amount of fungal diseases that you might possibly have. If you do have fungal diseases or other plant debris, even fruit that may fall, it's a good idea to pick that fruit up and to get it out of the orchard or to get it out of your planting. And so if you come to a time of harvest, it's good to pick not only the good fruit, but also the bad fruit as well. And you want to make sure that you have clean irrigation water, clean mulch, just good sanitation practice. Avoid any standing water. Tree fruit are known for not liking standing water. It's often referred to as a plant having wet feet. But providing adequate sunlight, tree fruit are full sun, and so you'll need to have at least 6 hours of sunlight per day. And make sure that you have some adequate spacing of your trees. And this comes into a more important effect on the commercial aspect of being able to take a sprayer down the rows and have some planning in the spacing of your trees as you're developing an orchard. Here is a table for some fungicides that we find commonly for home apple plantings. We have calcium chloride, captan, copper, mancozeb, mycoblutenol, and sulfur. And so some of these fungicides you may have heard before. A lot of our fungicides for the homeowner are contact kind of fungicides. So they provide a layer of protection. They can also be easily washed off. So after about 2 inches of rain, they can wash off and they have to be reapplied. And so this gives you some of the trade names that these fungicides are listed as, and there can be others. This is not specific to any of these particular products, but these are just to give you some examples. And these give you some examples of the diseases that they control, and there are more diseases that can be controlled by some of these products. I just gave you a sample of the main ones and the recommended rate for mixing. When it comes to apple scab, it's one of our more common diseases, and it is a fungal disease. You see in the photo on the left, it starts out and it has these olive green lesions that occur, and it eventually will show up in the fruit. And you can see that in these 3 apples on the right-hand side. And so the fruit become infected, and we have to manage that infection. And this can also occur on crabapple trees. So we need to be mindful of that in planning the landscape. So the best way to manage apple scab, it can overwinter on those leaves, and so removing those leaves from the orchard is a good situation. So mowing those leaves on a commercial level, they often apply urea to those fallen leaves to help them compost more effectively. As I said, they can be found on crab apples, so spraying the fungicide on your crabapple tree would also benefit to reduce that amount of scab. And time of spray that you're going to be applying is from green tip until 10 days after petal fall, which is also approximate to your first cover spray. I have some fungicides listed here for apple scab management. The ones in red I have listed here because they can be maybe found for ornamental settings, but you need to be sure to read the label for what fungicide you're using and make sure that you follow that label so you know that it's being applied properly. And not all these active ingredients can be used on trees where the fruit will be eaten eventually, or there may be a restriction on how far you can use a particular fungicide up until the harvest time. And so a pre-harvest interval is what it's referred to. Here are some apple scab resistant cultivars. There's over 25 available, but I just wanted to give you some references on the amount of cultivars that are available for disease resistance for apple scab. When it comes to these fungicides for apple scab management, we do have a lot of choices, and as I said, most of them are protectants, and so they can be washed off. Now, if it's just a drizzle, there may be a time where you can still apply these. They do have somewhat of a buffer effect, but you don't want the fungicide to completely wash off and that residue to be completely off of the tree for very long, because then you lose the effectiveness of the fungicide. So if it rains over 2 inches, it's going to wash off that product and you're going to have to reapply. Now, there are some aspects of the different fungicides that you need to read the label and make sure. Captan is the primary fungicide that's put into most of our multi-purpose fruit sprays. And so those multi-purpose fruit sprays contain not only a fungicide, but they can contain insecticides as well. And so you may be restricted on when you can apply those, especially when it comes to bloom. You don't want to be applying insecticides during the bloom period, because that would affect our honeybee population and possibly other pollinators as well. So Captan, Immunox, wettable sulfur, they can all be used for apple scab. And it's important with their wettable sulfur to note not to use it with oil. And there can be some injury that can occur with some of these if the fungicide is used at the wrong time. We also have mancozeb, and this product's primarily used by commercial growers, but it can be used by the homeowner if they follow the label instructions. The main take-home message is to grow resistant varieties, and that will help to mitigate some of the disease pressure. Always use good sanitation and a proper fungicide spray program. They have what are known as FRAC groups. And so there's a fungicide resistance action committee. And so they've numbered the fungicides, and that number will be found on the label. And you want to rotate your fungicides so that way you avoid applying the same fungicide in that class over and over again and building up resistance to a particular fungicide. Most of these fungicides are applied in a window, probably 7 to 10, possibly 14 days. The next disease we have is a bacterial disease, and it's a disease called fire blight. And it gets its name because of the torch kind of appearance that it does for apples and pears. In this photo on the right, we have the apple, the particular shepherd's crook symptom that you'll find in apple. And so this is a telltale sign of fire blight. And you can see the browning of the leaves. This can form cankers. It can affect the blossoms, and it's mostly the infection period is during bloom. It can be found in the shoots, the fruits, and even the rootstock. And so there are resistant rootstocks that are available on the commercial level. And then it can also affect as I said, the pears. So it starts out these infected blooms, and it can move into the bacterium moves into the flower, and then it transmits through the stem, And so we'll look at some of the management strategies regarding to fire blight. So these cankers that occur during the dormant season, you're going to do some pruning, and so you're definitely going to want to have good sanitation. And so when it comes to sanitizing your pruning shears, usually you can use a 70% alcohol or a 10% bleach solution, although the bleach solution can be somewhat corrosive. But you want to have good sanitation because this can easily be spread by the bacteria. So you're going to want to remove your wood from the area, any prunings. You're going to want to remove that and destroy, possibly have a fire. Copper applications should be made at silver tip, but definitely before green tip. And again, applying insecticides before bloom can help, with some of these insects that can transmit fire blight. When it comes to the treatment or what to do about fire blight, often it's an antibiotic treatment, a streptomycin, that's during bloom or after a particular injury. So if there's a hailstorm that came through, that would be a point of triggering you to maybe apply streptomycin so you don't get infection. All of these are pretty much preventative chemicals that we apply after you've had the disease. You're trying to mitigate it, but the fungicides only go so far. And it can, move into the shoots, so definitely sterilize those tools that you're using. And with your chemical choices, from late dormant to green tip, you have copper, bloom, again, streptomycin sulfate or copper plus mancozeb, and petal fall, you shoot blight control, and you also have a phytotoxicity concern with the copper. Cedar apple rust, again, there's resistant varieties. They need a juniper kind of host, so separating those, at least from your home landscape. They do need the two hosts for that pathogen to survive. They create a gall on the juniper, and so removing those galls can help to lessen the effect. There are chemical controls of mycobutanol and mancozeb, and Captan is not effective against this particular pathogen. But it forms these spots on the leaves, and you'll find pustules that form, and so use those recommended fungicides to treat. Powdery mildew, you may be familiar with that. There's many species of powdery mildew. We have one in particular for apple, and it creates those white felty patches, but it also can cause russeting on the fruit, and so it particularly likes humid weather, and so there's an optimal temperature for disease development, but using those resistant cultivars and proper fungicides. Here I give you a list of some of the susceptibility of powdery mildew and some of the cultivars that you might find. Now, sooty blotch and fly speck, you might find this abbreviated as SBFS, and these are two mostly cosmetic diseases. They form on the fruit. There's a multitude of hosts for these particular diseases, but they are able to be wiped off from the fruit, and the fruit can still be eaten. But using proper management practices will go a long way. So again, properly pruning your fruit trees and increasing that airflow, following the spray schedule, and remove your alternate host. We have a variety of fruit rots that are referred to as summer rots. So we have bitter, white, black, and brown rot, and we'll be covering those. And they are of particular interest because they've been increasing in incidence of fruit rots in the Midwest. And so we've seen that even in the commercial orchard, that there's been a lot more prevalence of that in recent years. There some reasoning behind that, changing climate, the different patterns of rainfall that we've had, our fluctuating temperatures, possibly some of the reasons for some of our disease problems are, fall having so long warm temperatures into the fall, and then some of our extreme cold events. There has been some fungicide resistance that have developed in some of the chemicals that are used for some of these, and that can be noted on the commercial level. But there's also some new varieties that have been developed, and just following some good orchard management practices can help to keep the disease in check. Our first disease in these summer rots is black rot, and it can overwinter in cankers, mummy fruitlets, dead bark, brush, trunk cankers. And so then its infection time period is from petal fall to harvest. And so you're also looking at the probability that it can have dormant infection. So the fruit could be infected, but it not really show up until the fruit start ripening. And another one that we have that's similar is white rot. And so white rot, it has more of a soggy, drippy kind of fruit. It has irregular margins as far as the symptoms go. And it can have shallow bark cankers that can show up on the bark. Typically this happens whenever there's a stress event. And so the pathogen may be there, but until you've had that stress event, it hasn't made its way into the particular trunk of the tree. So you want to avoid, mowing too close to your tree, or any kind of wound that will happen to a tree can be an entryway into the tree for disease. So this white rot, it does have a difference in appearance for your red skinned to yellow skinned, and the symptoms may not be apparent until 4 to 6 weeks before harvest. So be mindful of that whenever you're growing, that the time that you see some of these, the infection period had happened long before. So the chemical control for white rot, mancozeb, can be used until bloom, and captan 10 days after petal fall until harvest. And so most of these controls you're going to be doing until harvest, and sometimes even whenever you've harvested the fruit, the disease can show up afterward after it's already been picked. Now when it comes to commercial fungicides, we have an efficacy table in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, and it gives some of the top commercial fungicide choices for some of these diseases if you're a commercial grower. But again, if that fungicide has been washed off after 2 inches of rain, you're going to have to recover it and reapply that fungicide. You have to make sure that the residue is maintained until harvest, and so your later harvest varieties, that may be a concern. And if you're an organic orchard, some of the chemicals might damage the skin, like your lime sulfur, and so that could worsen some of the rots. And with organic orchards, you're looking at dormant copper. It reduces the overwintering inoculum or the spores that are available, but it may not be enough to mitigate that disease. Sulfur, it can cause burning of the leaves, phytotoxicity. Cultural practices are always good, and irrigating well ahead of the heat wave so you prevent drought stress. The healthier the tree is, the less likely the chance of disease to affect it. And for these summer rots, putting the fruit below a certain temperature threshold is going to slow down the rot. Here we have bitter rot, and it's another rot. It usually appears in July and August, varying on the weather conditions, but it is a fungus that can infect directly through the skin of the fruit. And so high temperatures and high humidity are going to benefit the growth of this particular rot. It does have an orange salmon colored spores in a concentric ring, as we saw on the previous slide. and it has a particular V-rot in the flesh, and I'll show that on the next slide. You can see how there's a particular V appearance in the rot. So you're going to want to follow a fungicide program, and the broad spectrum protectants are most effective against the summer rots. And there are some highly susceptible cultivars for this particular disease. And here they are listed, and the bold are the ones that I found from an Illinois publication. You might have noticed on some previous slides RPD, and that stands for Report for Plant Disease. And so I've listed those. Those are publications that are available in my list of references. And so those are good because they give a lot of the cultural and disease information that you can apply in your home landscape. Apple fruit rot management, again, cleaning up your dead wood, making sure that you get that out of the site. Clean up any mummies that may form. You want to get those off the trees and off the ground. Eradicate as many alternative hosts. You're going to begin your spray application after petal fall, and choose an effective fungicide based on the particular list in your spray guide. Here's one that is a particular disease that often shows up through neglect of not putting on a spray. It's peach leaf curl. It can also happen on plum and nectarine, but it usually can defoliate the trees early in the season. And it usually takes 9 to 24 days to show up after infection. So, but one well-timed dormant application is all that really is necessary to prevent this disease from showing up. And so the fungicide can be applied in the fall after 90% of the leaves have dropped, or before the buds swell in the spring. Those are your two characteristics of when you would want to control. And so you also want to, when applying fungicides, be aware of the temperature and keep that into consideration. Here is peach scab, another common disease. It can infect the fruits, the twigs, the leaves. The top photo is a nectarine. It also affects the nectarines, and the lower photo is a Saturn peach. And so your fungicide applications are going to be recommended starting at petal fall, and you're going to be treating 10 to 14 days according to the label. Brown rot, another common disease for peach, probably one of the most common diseases. It is effective. A lot of these diseases, when the leaf wetness exceeds a certain threshold, that's whenever you see the particular disease. So if we have a particular dry season, you don't see as many fungal diseases. But the early onset of this disease can appear on green fruit. Here we also see it on a sour cherry. It's a host for all of the prunus species, so all of the stone fruit can be infected with brown rot, and it particularly happens with high moisture. And so you'll want to keep in mind the infections that you have, and again, remove any mummies or lessen your disease factor. So removing those mummies, pruning the blighted twigs because it can affect the twigs also, and your fungicide applications, you're going to want to manage those. Just good sanitation can go a long way when it comes to these tree fruit diseases. Bacterial spot, it affects peaches and nectarines, but your resistant varieties are going to be your best bet when it comes to bacterial spot. Some of the fungicides aren't as effective as what you would like, and phytotoxicity can be a problem. And there can be some antibiotics that could be applied, but the disease favors moist and warm conditions, and there's a higher disease severity in sandy soil. And so in sandy sites, that skin of the peach can be somewhat sandblasted by wind and the sand particles, and so trying to mitigate that, if you have, a sandy site for your peaches, you can try to mitigate that a little bit with cultural practices. But the varieties do differ in susceptibility. So again, planting resistant, tolerant cultivars, using your cultural practice, and fixed copper sprays from dormant bud through shuck split can reduce your fruit infection. Here's a table of disease resistance for peach cultivars. We have some for bacterial spot and also for leaf curl. And so this just gives you an idea of some of the disease resistance that has been found for bacterial spot especially. We have some cankers that occur in peach, and here's one, leucostoma. And so these cankers, they infect the wood, and they often cause a oozing from the infection point. And so you'll want to control this as best you can. It can eventually kill the tree by girdling branches. It's a fungal disease. It can be associated with stress from drought or pH or cold damage. So there's no commercial cultivars that are immune or resistant to this particular disease. Plant cold hardy varieties, so that way it's a better tolerant of from not getting winter injury. Plant disease-free nursery stocks, and there has been work on application of canker paints to where the fungicide could be mixed in with a 50% latex paint and then applied to the canker. Powdery mildew for stone fruits. Again, there's many species of powdery mildew. So we have one particular for peach. It can also get the same powdery mildew of apple, and it just causes different symptoms on the peach. So we have yellowing or distorted leaves, and it will reduce the yield. The severely infected leaves are going to cup upward and become brittle and often defoliate. So these can overwinter in the buds, and as the infection occurs, it can occur on the young leaves, and the sporulation is often related with the relative humidity being higher at night. So there is a wide temperature range for powdery mildew, so don't think that you possibly escape just because the temperature is not what you thought it was. So for powdery mildew management, again, those cultural practices of opening the canopy, making sure you have light and air circulation, penetration. There can be alternative host for powdery mildew, such as rose. So you might have to treat your roses or remove the nearby roses. And don't plant peaches next to susceptible apple varieties that could be infected. And here's some of those apple varieties listed. Powdery mildew can be managed somewhat organically with potassium bicarbonate, plus horticulture oil, and some sulfur-based products. And they're alternate your chemicals again to prevent fungicide resistance. Black knot causes cankers. It's a fungal disease. It can show up mostly in the twigs and branches. You'll often notice the swollen area, and it needs adequate moisture for this fungus to occur. So you want to remove the infected plums or other trees from the orchard edges. Remove the infected areas 2 to 5 inches below the knot or where that swollen area is, and then burn that particular material and get it out of the orchard. Spray the trees between white bud and shuck split, and again rotate your fungicides. Armillaria root or crown rot is a soil-borne fungi. And so it is a fungus. It has mycelium and mushrooms around the base of the tree. And so here we see what those mushrooms look like. And so good cleanup of an orchard. If you had an old orchard, it can infect the new planted trees from the remaining residue. And so the soil fumigation is not effective for mitigating this particular disease. So you want to avoid excess watering, avoid wounding the roots, and keep your trees healthy as possible. So selecting higher elevation may help for this particular disease. We have a disease that plagues a lot of different plants, especially in the area of fruit, Phytophthora. It is also a soil-borne pathogen. It can affect all the stone fruit crops, and it can spread and be maintained in the soil for a long period of time. And so you want to prevent this from occurring, so make sure that you're planting on a well-drained site. Keep your soil as dry as possible. Use resistant rootstock and good fungicide treatments. Here is a list of resources, and there's quite a wide variety of resources that are available. There's a lot of good photos and information, fact sheets, and this slide presentation is also in a PDF form in the resources. Here is some QR codes and websites for the Good Growing blog or the Good Growing podcast. Here is a photo of myself and my contact information. If you have any other additional questions, you can ask them now. We will take questions. And also, I have a brief survey that I've put together. So if you want to scan this with your mobile device and or go to this website, you can take a survey, and it will help us in the future.